So in our first session, previous session, we spoke about the different definitions for Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews, Jews of Arab Jews and Mizrahi Jews, and I tried to equate them with what would be the parallels. Only Sephardic Jews has an equivalent, which is Ashkenazi Jews. But if you go with the pure meaning of the word, it should be Jews of Germany, and that's not how people use it. And that goes back to what I said in the beginning of our seminar, which is that the term Sephardic Jews or Sephardi is a definition within the Jewish theology, and there is a distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazi, where the Sephardic culture was crafted mainly in Sepharad, but it was a continuation of the culture of Iraq, of the yeshivot of the Gaonim in Babylonia, and they were open-minded, broad horizons, and they were willing to incorporate the elements of the surrounding culture. And part of that was because they didn't feel the same animosity as was between Jews and Christians, especially in medieval Germany, where Jews were viewed as the killers of God, and where they themselves viewed the religion around them as pagan and idol worshipping and lustful. They tried to alienate themselves, what they thought, as much as possible from the surrounding culture. Yet at the same time, they also cultivated a very, very deep sense of reverence or jealousy to the Christian concept of martyrdom, because they believe this is the noblest sacrifice that one could make. So that was a serious problem within Ashkenazi culture. So as I said before, I have no problem, and I'm proud of using the term Sephardi, because as I explained to people, Sephardi is a term that includes the 1,000 years of existing in Spain, the 500 or 600 years of culture that existed simultaneously and predated Spanish culture, and what it brought later on to the broader Jewish world. And that's part of my heritage and who I am. If I go deeper and like more specifically, what is my culture within the Sephardic culture, then I'll say I'm Iraqi. So I am first a Jew. Within the Jewish world, I'm Sephardic. Within the Sephardic world, I'm Iraqi. And from the point of view where I was born in Israel. So I'm an Israeli, Iraqi, Sephardic Jew. So yes, our identity in any way is multi-layered and complex, and we cannot sum it up with one word. However, a while ago I wrote an article which I want to share with you, and I want to go read a little more in depth, because I had to squeeze it in an editorial in the newspaper, and therefore the references are sometimes very very short, and I counted on the readers to go and read further. Before that, so I'll show you the article that I wrote is called "The Bridge with Islam," and I opened it with the word "I am a Jew of Islam." So that article drew some interesting responses. On one hand, there were people who wrote back to me and said that I know nothing about Islam and about Judaism, and to those people I provided a list of 10 books that they should read about Islam, and then I said, let's talk. Other people were very appreciative of that, and the article was translated to Arabic and to Turkish and to German, Kurdish. I don't know what it was printed in the American Muslim, and as a result, also James Carroll invited me to the author of Constantine's Sword, which is an important book. Invited me to participate in an interfaith seminar in Islam, which is very interesting. But I want to show you, before I go to what I see as a Jew of Islam, how one of the most famous scholars on the Middle East sees that. The Jews of Islam, there's a book by that name written by Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis is considered one of the most authoritative and important scholars on the Middle East, and he has a book called The Middle East. And I read his book on the Middle East. It's very Eurocentric, very condescending on the Arab and the local cultures. There is, on the other hand, on the other side, you have the book of Edward Said, Orientalism, and there's somewhere in between. There are certain negatives in each culture, and there are problems, but to draw a totally negative picture is extremely problematic. So, this is what the author says: for Christians and Muslims alike, tolerance is a new virtue, intolerance a new crime. Meaning that only now they start seeing intolerance as a crime and tolerance as a virtue. Only now. For the greater part of the history of both communities, tolerance was not valued, not was intolerance condemned. Until comparatively modern times, Christian Europe neither prized nor practiced tolerance itself, and was not greatly offended by its absence in others. The charge that was always brought against Islam was not that its doctrines were imposed by force, something that seemed normal and natural, but that its doctrines were false. Now that is a false view of Islam and Christianity, because although both religions were violent at their inception, Islam was more violent at its inception than Christianity, because the early Christians were persecuted by the Romans. The Christianity waged many more wars against the unfaithful or the infidels than Islam, starting with its persecutions against the early Christian, turning against the Romans who persecuted them during the Crusades in Europe. The Crusades are hailed as in outside Jewish culture as the Crusaders are heroes, and the Templars are like those who seek the Holy Grail or the Lost Ark in the Indiana Jones movies. But they were murderers. They were people that pillaged and killed everyone, and the church waged wars against all the heretic sects. They were the iconoclasts and the Arian heresy, and then the Cathars and the Albignes and the Huguenots. All if you search for Christian heresy and the Inquisition, that was first established to fight heresy within Christianity, you don't find the equivalent and in the Arab culture. There were wars, of succession. There were wars of religion also, but not as fierce as they were within Christianity. And the same Islam, the same Quran that says that Din Muhammad Bisayf, or the ideology of Muhammad should be enforced by the sword, also said not to attack the infidels or to accept those who believe in God. And Islam accept Jesus and Moses as prophets. There are three prophets: Nabi Musa, which is Moses, Moshe, Nabi Isa, Jesus, and Nabi Muhammad. So they have, and throughout history, we could look back and see where did the major attacks against Jews happen. They did not happen under the rule of Islam. The greatest catastrophe in the history of the Jewish world is the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was carried out, 99% of it, in Christian territories. And if you read Constantine's Sword, you'll find out that it was under the eye of the church. The Catholic Church acquiesced and actually brokered deals with the Nazis. The previous disaster before that, the ones that we remember well, are the pogroms in Russia. Also a Christian land. Before that, the expulsion from Spain, also under the Catholic kings. Before that, the Crusades. Before that, the second destruction of the temple. That is where Christianity did not exist yet, but the roots of the religion are there. So to say that tolerance was not valued is really, to me, comes from a point of ignorance. And after I wrote the article, I was sent a book. I was contacted by a professor of philosophy, of Moroccan origin in the University of Minnesota. His name is Anwar Majid, and I read his book, amazing book called A Call for Heresy, where he shows that in the early Islam, heresy and controversy was actually encouraged. People were encouraged to find new ways to think, even if they were considered heretical. And the term for that in Arabic was zandaqa, Zandaqa. Let's see if I could find it here. 1 second. Yeah. Let me show this to you here. So we see it comes from the word zindiq in Arabic, medieval Islamic term applied by Muslims to individuals are considered to hold views or follow practices that are contrary to central Islamic dogmas. And Majid proves that it was encouraged, that they didn't have the auto de fe where people were burned at the stake because of their heresy. So that is important to know, because I keep hearing the name, Bernard Lewis as the major scholar of the Middle East. Or here's another important scholar that people study when they study about Jews from Arab land, Norman Stillman. Right, he has the book called Jews of Arab Lands, a history and a source book, and they say that Stillman has been the executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World. Interesting that it is not done by a scholar who is rooted in the Islamic world, but someone who's sort of an outsider, is not part of that culture. And when you read his book, you really see that there's that negative attitude towards Sephardic Jews or Jews of the Arab world or the Jews of the Islamic world. And if something is highlighted, the first thing that you find are the decrees against the Jews, and the cases where there were attacks, they were. I'm not saying that Jews under Islam lived a completely peaceful and harmonious lives, but it was nowhere as catastrophic and cataclysmic as under Christian rule. So those are things that are important to have in mind. I don't know if people could have the time to read and go through that, but I want to go for a second to this article that I wrote, called it The Bridge of Islam. And that is what I wrote. I said, I am a Jew of Islam, not an Arab Jew, mind you, since that term makes as much sense as Slavic or Baltic or Aryan Jew. Rather, I'm a Jew of Islam. What I meant to say by that is when you use the term Arab Jew, you identify the Jew with the Arab culture. Now, what will you do with, for example, the Jews of Persia? The Jews of Persia are Jews who live under the rule of Islam, but are not Arab per se. They're not considered Arabs. The Persian Jews or non-Jews do not see themselves as part of the Arab nationality. They are Aryans. They are Farsi. So they don't fall under that. And on the other hand, Ashkenazi Jew, what is Ashkenazi Jew? Arab is not Muslim. Just as Arab is not Muslim, so Slavic or Baltic or Aryan is not a good definition for an Ashkenazi Jew. That's why I say that I am a Jew of Islam, meaning that I am a Jew whose culture evolved under the rule of Islam. And I said this, it's not only because my family's veins runs the blood of people who lived in Iraq, Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Turkey, nor because among my congregants there are natives of Bahrain and Indonesia. So that I picked those countries. That was when I was in Los Angeles. I had people who had family in Bahrain, and one congregant whose relative served in the Parliament of Bahrain, and I have congregants, and I still am friendly with them, who were born in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world. But they only got there in the late 1800s. They were Jews of Iraqi origin who migrated to India and from India to Indonesia. And there are families like the Mizrahi, the Masri, traditional Sephardic names. I also said that, that my iPod is packed with Abdul Wahab, Fakhri, Farid al-Atrash, Those are Egyptian and Syrian musicians. Fakhra is still alive; the others are already dead. The Shabbat songs and liturgy borrows freely from generation of Islamic Sufi and secular Arabic music. That is also true, but the connection runs much deeper. I am a Jew of Islam because Judaism under the rule of the Crescent took a different course than that under the rule of the Cross. The Jews of Islam, although decreed by the Pact of Omar as dhimmis or second-class citizen, never experienced the same level of hatred, anti-Semitism, and persecution which were the daily bread in Christendom. They were not demonized as God-killers and did not have to defend their religion in public disputations. That is important. The public disputations were an invention of Christian Spain. They happened in Spain, but under the rule of the Christians. There were people like Pablo Cristiani and Raimundo Martini, some of them converts from Judaism to Christianity, who engaged rabbis, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachmanides, in public disputations where Jews had to defend their religion. After the Jews succeeded in defending their religion, the rulers found out that this is a great way to lure the leaders, the Jewish leaders, out of their communities. So they started to bring more and more, create more disputations. This way, in that manner, they detached. They were able to sever the ties between the leaders and their communities, because the leaders had to spend long time at the royal court during the disputations, and were not able to take care of their community. So they broke their communities apart. Jews of Islam were not expelled en masse on religious ground from Muslim country as they were from England, France, and Catholic Spain. Right? Those are historical facts. There was a different type of life under Islam. As a rule, Islam used to be much less fanatic than Christianity. The number of wars waged and the amount of lives lost by the followers of the man who said, "Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, resist no evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also," is mind-boggling. And that is important because today, especially, there's a lot of anti-Muslim literature, Islamophobia, and I've seen on the cover of one book. After I wrote the article, the actual quote is like, "Who would you rather follow? The one who said turn the other cheek, or the one who said enforce your religion by sword?" And the irony of that is that the followers of those who said turn the other cheek, Jesus, the Christians, never turned the other cheek. They went with full force and killed anyone who stood on their way. Just think of South America. Who destroyed South America? By the name of what religion? The Native Americans of South America were killed by the missionaries to prevent them from bringing human sacrifices. But they basically sacrificed all of them, dozens of millions of them. And that violence was not directed only against other monotheistic heathens, such as Muslims and Jews, but also against Christians who deviated from the norm. The Crusades, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and the Inquisition are just some example. The last one, the Inquisition, was founded by disciples of St. Francis of Assisi, which, by the way, the current Pope, isn't he? Pope Francis, right? And everybody was amazed that he took upon himself, he took the name Francis. And he was a gentle soul. He preached to the birds, "My little sisters, study always to give praise to God, unto God." So his disciples founded the Franciscan order, and the Franciscan order established the Inquisition. This is how, when we say practice what you preach, this is where we have the problem. The people who come and say that you have to be extremely gentle and humble and loving are the same people who come with this attack against other humans. And I think part of it also has to do with the emphasis on martyrdom in Christianity. Think of that. If the religious leaders live their lives in total abstinence, they're not allowed to marry, They're not so even though they could drink wine and eat, but the sexual drive is completely suppressed. Then and some of them would live under vows of no talking. The life in the monasteries. You just mentioned that you're reading Stephen Goldblatt, Revital. You should read his book The Swerve, where he describes the way of the daily life in the monasteries. The monks were basically abused and tortured by the abbots and the heads of the orders, and that influenced their view, their way they treated others. There's a famous Hasidic story about a rabbi who's one of his followers, one of his Hasidim, came to him and bragged about the fact that he decided to take upon himself a very austere lifestyle. He said, "From now on, I'm only going to drink water and eat dry bread." And the rabbi yelled at him. He says, "You are rich. You can afford lavish meals. I want you to eat well according to what God has afforded you." And when he left, the disciples asked the rabbi, "Why did you yell at him? You yourself, you don't eat that much." The rabbi answered, "As long as that man was eating well, he thought that the poor deserve at least bread and water. If he starts eating dry bread and water, he will think that the poor could live on grass or gravel maybe." So when you take that mentality and you apply it to the way of the Christian austerity, of the Christian asceticism, you could realize why they were harsh with the population, whether they were Christians or Jews, because what they believed in was the ultimate reward is in the world to come. If you look at the depictions of the Inferno from medieval times, whether it's Dante's Inferno or Hieronymus Bosch and his drawings of the people in the afterlife, they viewed all they cared about is avoiding torture in hell and getting into paradise. And if paradise was secured by killing the non-believers, so be it. And so a person could come, one could come to another human being and say, "I love you, and I want you for that. I want you to believe in Jesus, so I could save your soul. But if you would not listen to me, I have no choice but to kill you. And this way, at least, I guarantee that my soul goes into paradise." This is the kind of mentality that we have to think about. I don't think that we could understand Sephardic culture without understanding under which conditions Ashkenazi culture evolved. So I'm writing that it did so. The Inquisition, it did so with such atrocity and cruelty in the Old and New World that the Abu Ghraib tortures pale in comparison. If anyone who reads the protocols of the Inquisition and what they did to people who were accused in heresy, it is just mind-numbing. You can't even read that. The so-called Western civilization, and what we call the Europe and Christianity, has just emerged from a long history of religious intolerance. The much celebrated Nostra Aetate Declaration was only issued in 1965, mere minutes ago in historic perspective. The Nostra Aetate was a declaration by the Pope where he cleared the Jews. It graciously acquits most Jews from the sin of killing Jesus and calls for peace and religious tolerance. But it stresses that the Lord Christ is the only true God and that we foster friendship in order to bring all humanity to believe in Him. That's not tolerance. That's saying, I will let you live for now until you all come to recognize that Jesus is God. And the way we were acquitted of the sin of killing Jesus, that was not saying that the accusation in the New Testament are false, and that the account of the execution of Jesus was written 60 or 70 years after he died, but rather the explanation was that the Jews who are living today are not the same Jews who killed Jesus. So they should not be held responsible for this. Is the tolerance. The Nostra Aetate is the document that shows us the tolerance of the church. It happened in 1965, 17 years after the end of the Holocaust, where the church stood idly by and did nothing to save the Jews. Yes, there were many good Christians, many good Hasidei Umot HaOlam, but the church, as an entity, as an establishment, did nothing to help the Jews. And if they did, in most cases, it was in order to possess their souls and convert them to Christianity. They were not willing to give them back. It recognizes, that is the Nostra Aetate, it recognizes that in the past there were some quarrels, quote, between the church and the Muslims, but urges people to forget the past and start anew. And I wrote that His Holiness was probably not aware of Santayana's words, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Just to say, let's forget the past is not enough. An apology and a way to make up for what the church did to the Jews. This is what is really due. The riches of the church that were looted from the Jews, and in general from all of their citizens. If the church really wants to make amendation, they have to come forth. There's no equivalent to the Vatican in terms of a religious institution that holds so much money and power. Anyway, again, like I said, in order to understand Sepharad, you have to understand Ashkenaz. Here is an example. Much greater tolerance is conveyed in the address in 1805 of Chief Sagoyewata to Christian missionaries. Brother, you say that there is but one way to worship and serve the Great Spirit. If there is but one religion, why do you white people differ so much about it? Why do not all agree as you can all read the book? Brother, we do not wish to destroy your religion or take it from you. We only want to enjoy our own. It's amazing, such powerful words. This could have been written by Jews as well. It says we were not trying to destroy anyone's religion, just to live our own. But again and again, we were told that we cannot practice it. And the Native Americans in North America were forced first to abandon their religion, then, as you know, to abandon their culture, to abandon their language. They were forced by torture by the American government to forget their language. Kids were separated from their parents, so they will forget their native languages. So looking back, we should ask ourselves what happened to moderate and enlightened Islam. Why, as Harold Bloom writes in his foreword to Menocau's Ornament of the World, there are no Muslim Andalusians visible anywhere in the world today. So that reference, Maria Rosa Menocal, Ornament of the World, I recommended that book to you, is a book about Al-Andalus. That is the name of Spain that was given to Spain by the Muslim conquerors. Nobody knows the exact etymology of the name. Menocal suggests that it actually a word that comes from the language of the German conquerors who lived there before the Muslims, and it means in their language, Hlan Dahlut means the lowland, like the Netherlands. So Menocal describes the convivencia of Al-Andalus. There was with violence and wars and all that, still there was a cultural flourishing that was unparalleled until the Renaissance. And actually, without that kind of cultural activity, as I mentioned before, the Renaissance would not have been possible, because it were the scholars of Al-Andalus who continued the tradition of the scholars of the Gaonic period in Babylonia, Jews and Muslims, who translated the works of the Greeks and the Romans into Arabic and kept them alive, and kept studying and wrote encyclopedias and promulgated knowledge, music, literature, poetry, philosophy, history. They did all that. Tremendous trove of culture in that Al-Andalus. Why don't we see it anywhere in the world today? So here here my focus was on the what is happening between Islam and Christianity today, but it also has to do with the way the Ashkenazi world views the Sephardic world, and there is still discrimination today, and that is that when the West met East in modern times, it was an encounter infused with arrogance, religious zeal, and greed. The colonialist and imperialist forces looked down at and did not bother to understand the natives. Missionaries tried to save lost souls, a goal that justified all means, and the spoils of the Oriental and African world were divided among the culturally superior conquerors. When we talk about the British Empire, right? The British Empire is this tiny island that controls 90% of the world, and that is until recently in the just now. The papers were released about what the British did in Kenya in the 1960s with the Mau Mau underground, horrific tales, and it was that feeling of superiority that because of a certain constellation or status of the forces, political, economic forces in the world, that allowed the West to take advantage of the East. And even when the East under the Ottoman Empire tried to get out of the situation, the British messed up this whole thing with their meddling, because they knew that there are oil, there are tremendous oil reserves. They just found British Petroleum, found out that there are tremendous oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. That was before it was called Saudi Arabia. It was called the Hijaz Peninsula, and they wanted to make sure that there's a ruler there that could oppose the Ottoman Empire and even topple the Ottoman Empire. And when they did that, by doing that, in order to do that, they supported the House of Saud, and they pushed them to supremacy, and eventually they became the rulers of Saudi Arabia. And whenever there was a chance of the local rulers to take care of events, like in the late 1800s, the local Jamal Peha was the ruler, or Aziz Peha, I forgot the name, who was the ruler of Baghdad, and was on the path of making the city an organized and progressive city. He was foiled by the Austrian, French, and British embassies, because they didn't want to have order in the city. They were interested in chaos. They, very much like what the Pentagon did in Nicaragua and Chile and the Iran-Iraq war, this being meddlesome in order to wreak havoc and create chaos and reap the fruits either by selling weapons or buying oil, whatever it is. So the story is much more complicated than what meets the eye. So that idea of supremacy seeped into the Jewish world as well, and especially in the religious world. Ashkenazi Jews in the yeshiva world viewed themselves as superior in terms of learning and understanding than the Sephardic Jews, which became unfortunate as events turned on to put some people in an advantageous position. So I would ask this: is there any wonder that nationalist and religious forces eventually sprang to action in order to counteract that hostile takeover? This is not the justification. It's just saying that when people completely reject or suppress or oppress the cultural heritage of one country, it will come back by force. This is what happened in Turkey. Ataturk and the Young Turks tried to completely eliminate the religious and Islamic heritage of Turkey, and it came back with brutal force. We know what is happening now in Turkey. Same thing in Egypt. Egypt tried to completely eliminate the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, and it came back with a tremendous force until that the Arab Spring sort of revolution again and again turned things over, and that happens everywhere. So part of the animosity that now you find in the Muslim world towards the European world is that feeling that for hundreds of years they have been taken advantage of by them. So in order to remedy that, I'm writing here is it's the problem of the world today is not Islam but rather religious fanatics. Today are mostly they are mostly Muslims, but I said we can also find a religious zeal in our country. Now that was written in I think 2008, 2007, and I think that since then we saw much more religious zeal here because we have a country that is in favor of separating church and state, but is holding back stem cell research, fights pro-choice supporters, and discriminates against the LGBT community. So all these things are signs of religious zeal. We just read them differently. Finally, I'll conclude with this. The remedy for fanaticism today is to support and promote proponents of moderate Islam, to bring back the glory of Andalusia, Cordoba, and Granada, and prepare cadre of imams and Quran scholars who are willing to accommodate to changing times, simultaneously teaching Westerners about Islam. I think that is also the remedy for fanatic Jews, because we have a lot of fanatic Jews, is to teach them a moderate approach to religion and to teach them that it's not about converting the other guy to be like you, and it's not even about tolerance. Tolerance means that I am willing to let you live as you are. I'm tolerating you. That's not good enough. Acceptance is not one that teaches our ways to others, but rather one that searches to solve conflicts and violence by drawing upon each one's own culture. I respect your culture, you respect my culture, as long as we understand that we don't harm each other, we don't harm people within our culture. And like I said here, it's a long and difficult way, but history has a long breath and memory, and it will wait. Meanwhile, we don't have to build a bridge with Islam, we just open for traffic the ancient one. That was the conclusion of my article. And the way I wrote here, I could have written the whole thing the same way, saying I'm a Sephardic Jew, because I believe this is part of the belief system and the worldview of Sephardic Jews, of the traditional and classic Sephardic Jews. It was the mentality of accepting the world around you, being steeped in general knowledge and secular knowledge, and keeping your tradition and observing Jewish law, respect to all, and trying to understand the community. And those are things that we're missing today. And we'll see next week when we read the article of Nissim Leon, which I recommend if you have access to academia, you have it through the AJR, to log on and download the whole article. There's an article of Nissim Leon about you'll see about the structure of the Sephardim within the Haredi society in Israel. And we'll see that today, that Sephardic culture that I'm talking about, and as well as just like the Islamic culture in the general Islamic world, is being eroded by clerics, by fanatics, by people who want to adhere to the written word of the law and not allow for flexibility in any way or means. The rabbis that we discussed before, like Rabbi Yosef Messas, Rabbi David Shlush, Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Toledano, and others that I will talk about, Rabbi Ben Zion Mihai Uziel, they were the ones who were trying to preserve and to promote that kind of Sephardic spirit, but for some reason their legacy has been sort of steamrolled by some leading figures in the Sephardic world. We'll talk about it, God willing, next week.